a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Palace of Westminster. The Palace of Westminster is the meeting place of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the two houses of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, commonly known as the Houses of Parliament after its occupants. The palace lies on the north bank of the River Thames in the City of Westminster, in central London. Its name, which is derived from the neighbouring Westminster Abbey, may refer to either of two structures: the Old Palace, a medieval building complex destroyed by fire in 1834, and its replacement, the New Palace that stands today. The palace is owned by the monarch in right of the Crown and, for ceremonial purposes, retains its original status as a royal residence. The building is managed by committees appointed by both houses, which report to the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Lord Speaker. The first royal palace was built on the site in the 11th century, and Westminster was the primary residence of the Kings of England until fire destroyed much of the complex in 1512. After that, it served as the home of the Parliament of England, which had been meeting there since the 13th century, and also as the seat of the Royal Courts of Justice, based in and around Westminster Hall. In 1834, an even greater fire ravaged the heavily rebuilt Houses of Parliament, and the only significant medieval structures to survive were Westminster Hall, the cloisters of St. Stephen's, the Chapel of St. Mary Undercroft, and the Jewel Tower. The subsequent competition for the reconstruction of the palace was won by the architect Charles Barry, whose design was for new buildings in the Gothic Revival style, specifically inspired by the English Perpendicular Gothic style of the 14th–16th centuries. The remains of the old palace were incorporated into its much larger replacement, which contains over 1,100 rooms organized symmetrically around two series of courtyards and has a floor area of 112,476 square meters. Part of the new palace's area was reclaimed from the Thames, which is the setting of its nearly 300 meters facade, called the riverfront. Barry was assisted by Augustus Bugin, a leading authority on Gothic architecture and style, who designed the interior of the palace. Construction started in 1840 and lasted for 30 years, suffering great delays and cost overruns, as well as the death of both leading architects. Works for the interior decoration continued intermittently well into the 20th century. Major conservation work has been carried out since then to reverse the effects of London's air pollution, and extensive repairs took place after the Second World War, including the reconstruction of the Commons Chamber following its bombing in 1941. The palace is one of the centres of political life in the United Kingdom. Westminster has become a metonym for the UK Parliament, and the Westminster system of government has taken its name after it. The Elizabeth Tower, in particular, which is often referred to by the name of its main bell, Big Ben, is an iconic landmark of London and the United Kingdom in general, one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city, and an emblem of parliamentary democracy. The Palace of Westminster has been a Grade I listed building since 1970 and part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1987. Old Palace. The Palace of Westminster site was strategically important during the Middle Ages, as it was located on the banks of the River Thames. Known in medieval times as Thorney Island, the site may have been first chosen for a royal residence by Canute the Great during his reign from 1016 to 1035. St. Edward the Confessor, the penultimate Anglo-Saxon monarch of England, built a royal palace on Thorney Island just west of the City of London at about the same time as he built Westminster Abbey. Thorney Island and the surrounding area soon became known as Westminster. Neither the buildings used by the Anglo-Saxons nor those used by William I survive. The oldest existing part of the palace dates from the reign of William's successor, King William II. The Palace of Westminster was the monarch's principal residence in the late medieval period. The predecessor of Parliament, the Curia Regis, met in Westminster Hall. Simon de Montfort's Parliament, the first to include representatives of the major towns, met at the palace in 1265. The Model Parliament, the first official Parliament of England, met there in 1295, and almost all subsequent English parliaments and then, after 1707, all British parliaments have met at the palace. In 1512, during the early years of the reign of King Henry VIII, fire destroyed the royal residential area of the palace. In 1534, Henry VIII acquired York Place from Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a powerful minister who had lost the king's favour. Renaming it the Palace of Whitehall, Henry used it as his principal residence. Although Westminster officially remained a royal palace, it was used by the two Houses of Parliament and by the various royal law courts. Because it was originally a royal residence, the palace included no purpose-built chambers for the two houses. Important state ceremonies were held in the Painted Chamber, which had been originally built in the 13th century as the main bedchamber for King Henry III. The House of Lords originally met in the Queen's Chamber, a modest medieval hall towards the southern end of the complex, with the adjoining Prince's Chamber used as the robing room for peers and for the monarch during state openings. In 1801 the upper house moved into the larger White Chamber, which had housed the Court of Requests. The expansion of the peerage by King George III during the 18th century, along with the imminent Act of Union with Ireland, necessitated the move, as the original chamber could not accommodate the increased number of peers. The House of Commons, which did not have a chamber of its own, sometimes held its debates in the chapter house of Westminster Abbey. The Commons acquired a permanent home at the palace in St. Stephen's Chapel, the former chapel of the Royal Palace, during the reign of Edward VI. In 1547 the building became available for the Commons' use following the disbanding of St. Stephen's College. Alterations were made to St. Stephen's Chapel over the following 3 centuries, for the convenience of the lower house, gradually destroying, or covering up, its original medieval appearance. A major renovation project undertaken by Christopher Wren in the late 17th century completely redesigned the building's interior. The Palace of Westminster as a whole began to see significant alterations from the 18th century onwards, as Parliament struggled to carry out its business in the limited available space and aging buildings. Calls for an entirely new palace went unheeded, as instead more buildings of varying quality and style were added. A new west facade, known as the Stone Building, facing onto St. Margaret's Street, was designed by John Vardy, built in the Palladian style between 1755 and 1770, providing more space for document storage and committee rooms. The House of Commons engrossing office of Robert Gunnell and Edward Barwell was on the lower floor beside the corner tower at the west side of Vardy's western facade. A new official residence for the Speaker of the House of Commons was built adjoining St. Stephen's Chapel and completed in 1795. The neo-Gothic architect James Wyatt also carried out works on both the House of Lords and Commons between 1799 and 1801, including alterations to the exterior of St. Stephen's Chapel and a much derided new neo-Gothic building, referred to by Wyatt's critics as the Cotton Mill, adjoining the House of Lords and facing onto Old Palace Yard. The palace complex was substantially remodelled, this time by Sir John Soane, between 1824 and 1827. The medieval House of Lords Chamber, which had been the target of the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, was demolished as part of this work in order to create a new royal gallery and ceremonial entrance at the southern end of the palace. Soane's work at the palace also included new library facilities for both Houses of Parliament and new law courts for the Chancery and King's Bench. Soane's alterations caused controversy owing to his use of neoclassical architectural styles, which conflicted with the Gothic style of the original buildings. Fire and reconstruction. On the 16th of October 1834, a fire broke out in the palace after an overheated stove used to destroy the Exchequer's stockpile of tally sticks set fire to the House of Lords chamber. In the resulting conflagration both Houses of Parliament were destroyed, along with most of the other buildings in the palace complex. Westminster Hall was saved thanks to firefighting efforts and a change in the direction of the wind. The Jewel Tower, the Undercroft Chapel and the cloisters and chapter house of St. Stephen's were the only other parts of the palace to survive. Immediately after the fire, King William IV offered the almost completed Buckingham Palace to Parliament, hoping to dispose of a residence he disliked. The building was considered unsuitable for parliamentary use, however, and the gift was rejected. Proposals to move to Charing Cross or St. James's Park had a similar fate. The allure of tradition and the historical and political associations of Westminster proved too strong for relocation, despite the deficiencies of that site. In the meantime, the immediate priority was to provide accommodation for the next Parliament. and so the Painted Chamber and White Chamber were hastily repaired for temporary use by the Houses of Lords and Commons respectively, under the direction of the only remaining architect of the Office of Works, Sir Robert Smirke. Works proceeded quickly and the chambers were ready for use by February 1835. In his speech opening Parliament in 1835, the King assured the members that the fire was accidental, and left it to Parliament itself to make plans for its permanent accommodation. Each house created a committee and a public debate over the proposed styles ensued. The neoclassical approach, similar to that of the White House and the federal Capitol in the United States, was popular at the time and had already been used by Soane in his additions to the Old Palace, but had connotations of revolution and republicanism, whereas Gothic design embodied conservative values. The committee in the House of Lords announced in June 1835 that the style of the buildings should be either Gothic or Elizabethan. On 14 July 1835 a royal commission was appointed. The chairman was Charles Hanbury Tracy and the other members were Edward Gust, Thomas Liddell, the poet Samuel Rogers and the artist George Vivian. The commission accepted the recommendation of a competition, and architects began submitting proposals following some basic criteria. In February 1836, after studying 97 proposals, the commission chose Charles Barry's plan for a Gothic-style palace, awarding him a prize of £1,500. Premiums of £500 each were given to David Hamilton, J.C. Buckler and William Railton. The architectural magazine summarised Barry's winning plan as a quadrangular pile, with the principal front facing the Thames, and a tower in the centre, 170 feet high. Barry, whose own architectural style was more classical than Gothic, built the new palace upon the neoclassical principle of symmetry. Augustus Pugin was instrumental in helping Barry win the commission. Pugin's contribution can be seen in the Gothic detail, the vanes and spires. Pugin also contributed greatly to the distinctive Gothic interiors, including wallpapers, carvings, stained glass, floor tiles, metalwork and furniture. In 1840 the foundation stone was laid by Charles' wife Sarah. The Lords' Chamber was completed in 1847, and the Commons' Chamber in 1852. Although most of the work had been carried out by 1860, construction was not finished until a decade afterwards. Frescoes. With the building itself taking shape, it was time to think about its internal adornments. In a process overseen by a Royal Fine Art Commission under the presidency of Prince Albert, a select committee which included Sir Robert Peel started to take witness accounts from experts in 1841. Those experts included Sir Martin Archer Shee, PRA, and Charles Locke Eastlake, painter and acknowledged authority on art history, soon to be first director of the National Gallery, and de facto administrator of the whole Westminster decoration project. It was decided that the opportunity should be seized to encourage the development of a national British school of history painting, and that the paintings should be done in fresco. The call for artists to submit proposals resulted in the first exhibition in 1843 at Westminster Hall, in which 140 cartoons were shown. Others followed, but the progress was slow. Fresco proved to be a problematic technique for the English climate, the wall surfaces to be covered being vast. A number of paintings were in fact done in oil on canvas. With the death of Prince Albert in 1861 the scheme lost its driving force, but by then many paintings were completed or underway. William Dyce, who was the first to start fresco work in 1848, died in 1864, completing only 5 of 7 commissioned works. The other major contributors were John Rogers Herbert, finishing in 1864, but having had some commissions cancelled, Charles Westcote, who worked until 1869, Edward Matthew Ward until 1874, Edward Armitage, George Frederick Watts, John Calcott Horsley, John Tenniel, and Daniel Maclise. In the 20th century, further paintings were commissioned from other artists. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?